Myth versus reality. Asterisk, you've probably heard that classical Kyoto was all elegance, a watercolor city of court ladies sprinkling poetry, like powdered sugar, of incense so pure it convinced the gods to write postcards of gratitude. Reality? It smelled faintly of damp wood, sweat, and burning animal fat used in lamps. The aristocrats coughed into embroidered sleeves, and the tea was bitter enough to make you question the purpose of civilization. You know that frozen perfection people imagine. The serene minimalism, the lacquered screens without fingerprints, the snow falling as if under divine direction. Yes, that's marketing. Like the way universities describe balanced workload. You are in Kyoto, the year 950, give or take an emperor's reign and a few miscounted lunar cycles. The capital still calls itself Heian-kyō, peace and tranquility, as if naming things would make them behave. You're sitting cross-legged on tatami older than your last bout of ambition. Tonight the air itself feels metallic, and your breath comes out like ghost commentary. Through the half-open shoji, you can just make out the stone lantern in the courtyard wearing its first hat of snow. You can pretend to find that romantic, but really the thing looks like it's preparing for its own funeral, white shawl draped, lips silent. Inside, the scent ceremony begins. The maidservant moves as if every gesture is being graded by divine bureaucrats. Too fast, you offend subtlety. Too slow, you become a cautionary poem. She picks up a fragment of fragrant wood, likely Kyara, worth more than most peasants' annual hope. You watch the smoke coil upward, thin, pale, disciplined. Supposedly this ritual calms the mind for sleep. It actually reminds you of cremation. Perhaps that's the intended effect. Nothing like contemplating mortality before bedtime. The head of the household, your host tonight, sits opposite, knees folded under his silk robes, expression so neutral it qualifies as a philosophy. He murmurs something about listening to the incense. You nod, even though your mind translates it as, listen to the money burn. He's a court official, bored with his privilege, yet terrified of losing it. His sleeves drag along the mats like exhausted ghosts of ambition. It's said that these ceremonies refine the senses. Sure, they refine your ability to smell debt, betrayal, and mould. Around you, the room performs its quiet trick. Wood creaks in slow intervals, a rhythmic inhalation, as if the house itself has lungs. You imagine it breathing with you, sighing with every reminder of impermanence. The lacquered surfaces reflect candlelight in liquid pulses. Somewhere outside, beyond the snowflaked veranda, a fox yelps, a sound too sharp for such a delicate night. You glance at the tea bowls lined in disciplined geometry. They stare back, empty but expectant. It occurs to you that the people who designed this ritual believed beauty could regulate despair. It probably couldn't, but maybe it distracted you long enough to forget famine statistics. They bring the tea, powdered green and faintly chlorophyll-scented, whisked into a froth that looks suspiciously like pond water having an existential crisis. You're told this is purity condensed. You take a sip. It's the flavor of leaf skeletons and gentle self-loathing. You smile politely. The host smiles back, eyes heavy-lidded, pupils reflecting the candle flame like data points. Somewhere between you and him is a gulf of centuries that pretend not to exist. You're both playing the same game. Make the void look graceful. The snow outside thickens, sound muffled, until the world feels padded. You catch yourself thinking of the servants, wet footprints in corridors, fingertips cracked from cold water. They'll sleep near the kitchen hearth later, dreaming of rice that's not diluted. Nobody writes poetry about their nights. Court diaries discuss melancholy weather, while someone outside dismantles ice from the roof with a bamboo pole. Realism is a banned substance in this century. Everyone prefers symbolic suffering. The incense deepens, sweet and resinous, like a diplomatic apology. Your host closes his eyes, perhaps imagining that the smoke carries all stains of living upward and away. You know better. It just climbs until it hits the ceiling, then disperses like forgotten ambitions. In 1,000 years, historians will romanticize this moment, describe you as part of a golden age of refinement. They'll ignore the draft cutting through the seams of the shoji, the way your toes sting inside their fabric prisons, a faint itch in your throat from indoor smoke. Civilization, it turns out, is mainly good at masking discomfort under elaborate etiquette. Do you feel tranquil? Of course not. You feel observed by objects. The writing brush beside you seems to wait for confession. The lacquered tray demands composure. You can't even sneeze without performing history. Everything here is designed for someone's idea of eternity. The proportions of the room, the angle of the candle stand, the measured manner of handing a cup. Yet eternity smells faintly of mildew. You shift slightly, trying not to disturb the matte pattern, a futile gesture that feels symbolic anyway. Outside, the courtyard lantern wavers in silhouette. A bird, probably a crow, lands on its cap of snow, sends a spray of powder falling. That's realism intruding, rude as truth. The host opens his eyes again, remarks that the first snow is auspicious, a sign of purity descending. You consider replying that purity also resembles hypothermia, but you spare him the insight. Humour isn't part of tonight's prescribed virtues. Still, the absurdity hits you. People who could be arguing politics instead argue fragrances, comparing one whiff of Kyara to another as if decoding national security secrets. They pass you another bowl. You accept it with two hands, a gesture choreographed by centuries of cautious diplomacy. The tea's warmth leaks into your palms. It's the closest thing to sincerity this evening. You think of everyone outside the capital scraping mud for food. A city of refinement surrounded by a country of hunger. That's civilization in summary, polished suffering framed as aesthetic. The conversation drifts into poetry. Your host quotes an ancient verse about snow and solitude. You wonder whether solitude was ever optional for the writer, or merely inevitable. The words roll softly, elegant but hollow, like porcelain that forgot its purpose. Ironically, while he speaks of transcendence, his stomach likely growls under the robes. Ceremonial fasting is fashionable among courtiers. Hunger makes everything sound spiritual. A few more servants enter, noiseless as regrets. They adjust the charcoal brazier, add another block, and the fire brightens to dull orange, the colour of tired intentions. The light licks across the wall scroll, revealing an ink painting of mountains. The brushwork trembles slightly. Maybe humidity warped the paper, or maybe even art can't pretend to be calm forever. You study the lines, imagining the painter's hand halfway between devotion and cramp. The mountain stands eternally still, yet you can tell it's an act. Somewhere, down the corridor, a bell chimes. It's a small bronze one used to mark the hour of closing lamps. Its tone stretches through the wood like liquid metal. Time here doesn't pass. It seeps. You look at the candle, its wax barely receding, stubborn against history's erosion. The shadows it throws are animated. They crawl across the tatami, climb your sleeve, settle at your wrist. Everything feels conscious, as if even inanimate matter here participates in performance anxiety. Say you believe the myth that Heian nights were serene, holy, untouched by the vulgarities of existence. Then explain the cough in the next room, the faint drip from the ceiling joint where melted snow sneaks in, the smell of wet straw shoes left near the entrance. Peace, it appears, is just well-managed discomfort. You sip again, taste bitterness layered on bitterness, until you feel oddly calm. Your tongue goes slightly numb, perhaps enlightenment's first symptom. The host remarks on the snow again, notes how flakes resemble scattered petals from heaven. You nod mechanically. Heaven, apparently, has terrible horticultural habits. If petals fall frozen and melt into mud, what message is that? Maybe the gods have a sense of humour somewhere between cosmic irony and bureaucratic incompetence. That idea pleases you more than the tea. He gestures toward the incense burner, silver carved with cranes. Each scent tells a story, he says, delivering wisdom like expired currency. You lean forward, pretending interest. The smoke curls like fine handwriting vanishing mid-sentence. Its story might be simple. Wood dies beautifully. You catch the faintest flavour of salt in the air, perhaps from your own skin drying or the ocean memory embedded in every living thing. Kyoto may be inland, but everything here still smells faintly of distance. The ceremony shifts. A servant replaces the incense with the next variety. Ranjatai maybe, legendary enough to make tax collectors weep. They handle it with tweezers, reverent as surgeons operating on ghosts. You resist, laughing. The wood fragment is perhaps older than the Emperor's illusions. Its journey from tropical forests to this room spells centuries of misplaced reverence. When burned, it releases an aroma somewhere between sanctity and cost accounting. You breathe it in, half expecting enlightenment, half expecting an allergic reaction. You realize the ceremony isn't about scent at all. It's about hierarchy. Everyone's posture encodes obedience. Every waft of perfume announces wealth. The incense doesn't transcend anything. It reinforces everything. You sit among the coded gestures and wonder what future historians will call this culture, art, or elaborate anxiety management. The snow thickens. You can no longer hear the distant city. Drums, gossip, cartwheels, all swallowed by white silence. The world shrinks to the room in the slow conversation of smoke. You begin counting your breaths out of habit, noticing how they sync with the minor tremor of the candle flame. You think of time as something that burns quietly until someone opens the window. Maybe that's philosophy. Or maybe it's just insomnia wearing cultural disguise. A servant kneels to refill your cup. Their hands are red from chill. You pretend not to notice, because empathy during ceremony counts as indecorous. The tea steams faintly, curling upward to meet the incense. Two kinds of vapor merge, one refined, one merely necessary. For a moment it looks like equality, then it dissolves, as expected. Does the snow ever stop? You ask yourself, but not aloud. Probably not. It keeps falling even when forgotten. The flakes on the lantern now form a mound, turning the shape mossy and swollen. Each one is identical and meaningless, which makes them perfect metaphors for court officials. You suppress the smile that arrives uninvited. The host begins another round of polite reflection, this time on the virtues of restraint. He declares that the fragrance teaches modesty, the tea teaches humility, and the snow teaches patience. You suspect they teach boredom, but you nod, yes, humility indeed, as your spine protests against hours of ceremonial stillness. Discipline here extends to muscle cramps. You recall the rumor that the emperor sometimes disguises himself to wander the streets at night, seeking authentic life. You doubt he finds it. The city's authenticity usually sleeps behind paper screens or under straw mats. Authenticity, like incense, is valuable precisely because it's almost gone. You think of the artisans crafting these fragrant woods across distant seas, men sweating in tropical heat so someone in Kyoto can listen to their product. The global economy started earlier than textbooks admit. The candle flickers again, wax tears slide down its side. You focus on that slow drip. It's the only honest rhythm here. The servants shuffle in the background. Shadows among shadows. One coughs softly. The host's gaze shifts slightly, irritated at imperfection. You observe that irritation with anthropological interest. It's the moment when sanctity meets reality. The smoke grows denser. The air tastes faintly like sweet rot. You remember that this Kyara likely travelled centuries, soaked in resin, transformed by microbes. You're inhaling history, literally decomposed forests masquerading as divine aroma, the romance of decay wrapped in silk ritual. You should toast to that, but you remain quiet. The night presses against the walls. Snow whispers as it stacks higher. The room's temperature drops, but nobody dares notice. The host talks of the path to awakening, which sounds impressive until you recall everyone here sleeps on heated stones beside their servants. Awakening, yes, every dawn to the same politics. He invites you to compose a verse, as tradition demands. You take the brush, dip into ink darker than the heart of bureaucracy. You write clumsily, a few lines about snow on lantern, about smoke pretending to be spirit. The host nods, interprets it as profound. You realize he interprets everything that way. The gain isn't meaning, it's performance. The candle sputters, dropping wax like punctuation. You wonder what hourly wage aesthetic patience deserves. None, probably. In this world, beauty exists on unpaid overtime. The sleeve of your robe brushes the floor, drawing a faint line of dust. A small, accidental rebellion. History will call it texture. Through the half-open sliding door, you notice the garden pond half-frozen, surface indistinct. A carp moves beneath ice, uncertain whether stillness counts as survival. That carp might be the most philosophical creature in Heian-kyō tonight. You envy its simplicity. No incense, no etiquette, just the slow arithmetic of breath and liquidity. Your host coughs softly, covers it with his sleeve. Even illness here performs modesty. He gestures for another round of incense. The servant hesitates, the box nearly empty. But obedience trumps common sense. Another grain of precious wood sacrificed to appearance. You feel its scent invade your lungs like a polite conqueror. Your skin itches slightly, maybe from the dry air, or maybe from the centuries pressing invisibly around you. You wonder what modern tourists imagine when they photograph traditional tea houses. Probably tranquility. They should try surviving one night without central heating while pretending enlightenment. The host praises the dialogue between scent and snow. You mentally award him points for poetic nonsense. Outside, flakes continue their mute descent, burying the pathstones one layer deeper. Inside, everyone pretends that stillness equals virtue. You suspect stillness is just the default when alternatives are socially dangerous. A crack echoes from the brazier. Charcoal splitting, sparks momentarily bright. Everyone watches like witnesses to revelation. You watch ashes settle afterward, dull and grey, the natural end of enthusiasm. You realize this ritual is less about purification than management. It manages boredom, anxiety, mortality. Humans burn pleasant things to make unpleasant truths tolerable. In 950 Kyoto, they call it art. In later centuries, it will become therapy minus insurance coverage. You stretch slightly, discreetly, trying to redistribute blood to limbs. Your knees respond with the sound of unpolished joints. Refinement is physically expensive. The host pretends not to notice, continuing his sermon about harmony. Harmony, yes, the word bureaucrats use to describe stagnation. He asks your opinion of the latest incense blend. You tell him it reminds you of distant rain. He seems pleased, though neither of you has seen the ocean recently. Distance flatters people. It makes ignorance sound poetic. You want to ask what happens when the snow melts. Will purity leak into the drains? But you keep silent, watching the smoke twist like déjà vu. The candlelight pulses weaker, maybe the wax finally surrendering. Shadows loom larger. Somewhere outside, maybe in another wing, a shutter bangs. The house exhales cold. The tea cools, thick sediment forming at bottom. You set the bowl aside, your fingers cramped around its rim. Everything here congeals, sooner or later. Tea, air, intention. The host remarks that snow brings fresh beginnings. You wonder how fresh anything can be in a city surrounded by yesterday's echoes. Another servant appears with blankets folded, like moral conduct. You nod politely. Fabrics smell of smoke and storage, not purity. When draped around your shoulders, warmth feels temporary, conditional, borrowed privilege. You remind yourself this is peace, officially sanctioned peace. The incense burner sputters, smoke no longer rising but circling nervously. Maybe even sacred wood gets stage fright. You watch it fade, imagining microscopic ashes falling on the tatami, each a particle of extinct rainforest. Civilization thrives on metaphor while practicing extinction. Your host begins humming, low, melodic, a tune supposedly ancient, though nobody truly recalls its lyrics. It skims the air like tired nostalgia. You catch fragments of rhythm, wonder if the melody survived plague, war, tax audits. Probably. Art often outlives practicality. Faint footsteps echo through corridor. Another servant closing shutters. You hear snow brushed off the sill, the whisper of bamboo broom on frozen ambivalence. The world contracts further. The fire dwindles to small coals, eye-like embers staring back. You and the host sit in synchronized contemplation, disguised as enlightenment, but mostly fatigue. You think of myths, how future generations will distill tonight into elegance. The serene court ritual under the first snow, the wise fragrance masters, the poetic introspection. They'll emit fatigue, smoke coughs, cracked knuckles, and coin calculations, because suffering looks better framed in silk. The air grows heavier, thickened by unspoken thoughts. You breathe slower, watching condensation on your sleeve. The candle nearly gone now, the wick bending like surrender. Light will soon fail, leaving only the orange glow from brazier. You anticipate that darkness with a hint of relief. Softness, at least, arrives honest. The host murmurs a final phrase. Something about stillness as truth. You almost laugh. Truth here is just quiet enough not to contradict power. Yet you appreciate the effort. Lying gracefully requires craftsmanship. The incense smoke falters again. You watch its final thread vanish into ceiling shadows, silent as memory's expiration. The sound of snow outside persists. Small impacts, weightless thuds, everything moving towards silence. You shift focus to the faint texture of tatami beneath your fingers, dried rush woven into repetitive pattern. The surface scratches lightly, leaving ghost impressions on skin. You consider how those fibers once stood alive in a summer field, cut, dried, and pressed into geometry, all for tonight's illusion of calm. The tea bowl sits abandoned, rim glimmering faintly under residual light. You could refill it, reheat, pretend ritual demands continuity. But fatigue edges in, the ceremony technically ending, yet nobody proclaims it. In Heian etiquette, conclusions are suspicious. They imply awareness of time. So instead, you all hover mid-scene, waiting for history to move the frame forward. Outside, the lantern almost buried, snow shaping it into abstract purity, the garden path invisible. You wonder whether servants will dig it out tomorrow or let winter decide architecture. The sound of distant wind rises slightly, not violent but insistent, passing through cypress and tile. It brings faint scent of smoke from neighbouring houses. The same ceremony repeated across the city like synchronized yearning, everyone burning little pieces of the world for momentary peace. You lean back, eyes half closing. The ceiling beams above resemble bones, perfectly aligned decay. The candle finally dies, leaving only red coal glow. The host still upright, probably meditating or pretending. You watch his silhouette, outline trembling as fire fades. All that remains is breath and faint whisper of burning wood. You tell yourself this is culture, this is history, this is refinement. Yet somewhere underneath language, another voice mutters that it's snow, smoke, and waiting. Humans rehearsing transience over expensive props. The second stretch, the incense box empty. The tea cold, the snow relentless. Kyoto, the capital of peace, holds its breath. You almost hear it, the sound of centuries forming, quiet but inevitable. And the scene stays suspended, half light, half silence, as if even the snow hesitates before covering the last traces of motion. You breathe in one remaining curl of fragrance, dry, delicate, slightly bitter, the taste of time pretending to be divine, and exhale into the growing dark. Asterisks. Reality. Attic, you've been told that Heian period Kyoto is an age of refinement, gold lacquer and moon poetry, paper doors sliding open to reveal etiquette itself pouring tea. Reality? Termites, mould, men writing love notes with more perfume than sincerity. You are in the middle of that contradiction, crouched on a tatami that smells faintly of damp straw and last week's incense ash. The snow outside thickens like a lie that everyone agrees to believe, because saying the truth, it's freezing and nothing's eternal, would be indecent. You are supposed to be enduring serenity, whatever that means. The household has already dimmed its fires. Even the servants' footsteps withdraw into the corridors like gossip retreating into shadows. Somewhere in the rear wing, a brazier hisses, black charcoal sighing out its last complaint. You adjust your knees, a polite euphemism for the knees of a middle-aged aristocrat trying not to cramp, and watch the curling smoke rising from the incense cup. A courtier, your temporary host, presides over the ritual as though he invented mindfulness 8 centuries before Silicon Valley could patent it. He tilts his sleeve just so, moves the bamboo whisk as if stirring the surface tension of history itself. The gesture's elegance hides its absurdity, which of course is the point. You sip. The tea is thick, gritty, vegetal, more a punishment than a drink. Yet everyone smiles that same distant smile, as if tasting eternity. You want to cough. You don't. Civilization is basically the art of not coughing at the wrong time. The incense, they've told you, is meant to represent the seasons. Each grain of imported aloes wood, a fragrance note of metaphysical migration. Trade routes, stretching from tropical islands, through temples, over bandit-infested passes, just to end up burning into nothing in front of a few wealthy insomniacs. You breathe it in anyway. It's sweet, woody, and faintly medicinal. The smell of forests remembering what it was like to be alive. You think about the sheer logistics. How many sailors drowned so that one nobleman could have something interesting to smell before bed? This is the kind of math Kyoto seldom writes down. The cost of its calm, measured in anonymous corpses far from home. Outside, the courtyard stone lantern gathers snow like memory collects regret. Each minute layer adds weight but no sound. You were told that silence is purity, but here it's more like neglect, with good branding. The wind keeps catching the paper door, making it tremble. It sounds almost like breath. Or maybe the house muttering about its mortgage centuries in arrears. The lacquered pillars creak. The old beams leak the scent of smoke and pine tar, exhaling centuries of dinners and ceremonies. If wood could develop an opinion, these timbers would be condescending philosophers, too soaked in incense to care. You glance toward the alcove, where a screen painting of cranes surveys eternity with bureaucratic disinterest. Somewhere beneath the fragile pigment, the artisan's sweat has trapped itself like a signature. That's the trouble with eternity. It never quite dries. You know this. Every era has its favourite illusion, and in yours its refinement. A word delicate enough to hide decay. Across from you, your host clears his throat delicately, court style for announcing both enlightenment and indigestion, and begins to recite a verse. Snow, moon, blossoms, loneliness. The usual suspects. You nod appreciatively, because disagreeing with a poem here could start a diplomatic crisis. He smiles, sips, and peers into his cup as if trying to catch the reflection of reincarnation. You suspect he's mostly checking his teeth for powdery residue. If there were ambient music, it would be a mixture of distant bells and rodents. Buddhism promises detachment, but this room smells too strongly of attachment. Cedar, human skin, camellia oil. You realize that religion, even when perfumed, squeaks when the floorboards shift. The snow keeps falling. The city that claims to embody peace mutters in its sleep, dreaming of rebellions yet unborn. Someone slides the door open. It's the hostess, perhaps, or the ghost of one of those sailors who died ferrying your incense. She bows, sets down another tray, her sleeves whispering across the mats like water-tasting dust. Her face, undisturbed, not blank exactly, but tuned to that social frequency. Pleasant absence. The tray holds a fresh bowl, steam curling upward to negotiate with the incense smoke already occupying the upper air. You catch yourself wondering which cloud smells more expensive. "My lord," she murmurs, "please renew your moment with the fragrance." Her Japanese sounds like apology disguised as grammar. You lower your eyes because everyone here studies modesty like it's an Olympic sport. You take up the small silver tongs lying beside the ashbox. They gleam in the candlelight, perfect miniature instruments of ceremony and futility. You touch the charcoal chip, nudge it closer to the mica plate. The odour blooms instantly. Richer, darker, something between a funeral and a forest picnic. The attendants murmur approval, tiny exhalations of cultured ecstasy. Every sniff is a social negotiation. Myth versus reality. You think again. They say this is an age of peace. And technically it is, meaning the wars are merely postponed until someone else's generation. They also say the Heian court achieved an aesthetic so refined that even boredom became transcendence. You suspect they simply didn't own enough weatherproof architecture to attempt anything noisier. The snow keeps layering itself across the city. Kyoto, that well-visaged corpse-wearing makeup of white powder. Somewhere beyond your fence line, a guard dog sneezes into eternity. Somewhere further, a poet wakes to scribble about the noise of snowfall, then edits the sound out again. Everything is curated serenity, a museum exhibit pretending to live. You're complicit, of course. You're sipping from the same bowl, letting the same chemical nostalgia numb your tongue. You understand why. Because if you stop pretending, history notices. And history's attention is fatal. There's a faint crack as the charcoal splits. The fragrance wavers, the grainy air bending light and thought together. You inhale again. The scent makes your nose sting, carries with it the faint tang of salt and distance. A sailor's body has travelled a long way to reach your lungs. He might have drowned somewhere near Sumatra 8 decades ago, and here you are inhaling his afterlife through export receipts. Congratulations! You've just participated in the first truly globalized hallucination. Your host turns toward you, eyes drifting, voice soft. Do you sense the season's spirit? You could answer honestly, something about the spirit of mildew, but you murmur agreement. Behind him, the scroll on the wall shows Mount Hiei at sunrise. A painting done before sunrise learned about smog. Art here isn't about representation. It's about convincing the gods that humans can fake eternity convincingly. Outside, the snow brightens the world by dimming it, paradox well known to poets and other self-inflicted thinkers. The stone lantern's flame struggles, a small orange droplet in a cold universe. You think of how people will one day invent electricity so they can ruin darkness more efficiently. For now, the candle trembles. Its wax drips like time under stress. You notice your shadow quivers along the tatami, enlarged, then eroded as the flame flutters. Each shift adds decades to your imagined age. This is how centuries form, you think. Not through battles or invention, but through the incremental exhaustion of shadow. You would write that down if writing didn't require touching the freezing inkstone. Another sound, softer than breath, threads through the wall panels. A servant, shaking snow from his cloak. He's lived his entire life 3 rooms away from nobility, which is probably as close to enlightenment as anyone gets. Your host doesn't notice. Enlightenment has excellent insulation. For a moment you imagine the wider city, the alleyways where commoners sleep, roofs leaking, fires doused. You remember that Kyoto literally means capital, not comfort. 10,000 souls dreaming of court life while the court dreams of heaven, each equally fictitious. The smell of incense thickens, now tinged with bitterness as the wood consumes itself. The ceremony dictates precise timing. 3 rounds of fragrance, 2 of tea, but time itself feels unreliable, like an uninvited guest who nonetheless insists on staying. Then your host speaks again. You must listen to the snow. He says it with the gravity of a man quoting a famous dead poet. You pretend to listen. What you hear is your stomach reminding you that austerity diets predate both morality and refrigeration. You wonder whether in some future Tokyo, people will pay extra to rediscover starvation as a spiritual practice. Probably. The hostess enters once more, collects the empty bowls, and vanishes, graceful as a tax increase. The door shuts, leaving behind the blended scent of tea residue and burnt resin. You imagine an omniscient narrator intoning, and thus civilization advanced by inches via fumes and etiquette. But there's only you and the smoke still curling toward the ceiling like unfulfilled karma. The silence deepens. That old adjective, tranquil, wears thin under inspection. You hear a mouse scuttle beneath the floor planks, its tiny claws delivering a Morse code message from reality. You're sitting in rotting wood pretending it's culture. Fair point, mouse. You consider replying with a proverb, but the mouse doesn't respect literature. Eventually you lean forward, blow lightly across the incense ash, watching the embers redden, then fade. It's supposed to symbolize impermanence. Everything is symbolism here. except perhaps the taxes. You think of how centuries later, tourists will wander future Kyoto marveling at authenticity, never realizing the main ingredient of authenticity is selective amnesia. One log in the brazier sighs again. Another collapsing spine. Heat dribbles out like gossip. The air turns brittle. Your host finally speaks a benediction, low and formal, something about achieving stillness in motion. You murmur back, "Indeed," knowing both of you are lying courteously. Stillness 2,000 years old smells faintly of mildew. He gestures toward the walls, quoting some maxim about harmony. The snow outside, the ash inside. They complete each other. Deep down, he probably believes it. Or maybe belief is just good manners that manage to live past dinner. You fold your hands, eyes lowered, counting the beats until it's appropriate to yawn. The ceremony nears its end, which in this century means you've successfully obeyed a long list of prohibitions without snapping. Somewhere in the future, someone will rename this self-torture mindfulness and sell it as stress management. Here it's simply survival in silk robes. You watch the final swirl of smoke nervously performing its vanishing act. Every wisp that rises is a timeline closing, just another diplomatic envoy between breath and oblivion. You realize the empire itself runs on incense, burning something precious to maintain the illusion of continuity. Through the paper door filters a faint orange glow. The watch fires along the palace district, where night guards gossip to keep from freezing. The city beyond lies patterned like a chessboard of lanterns and ambitions. Even the snow knows its grid. It accumulates politely. You tilt your chin, catch a drop of melting wax on your sleeve. It cools instantly against the silk, leaving a pale scar that will outlast your relevance. In another 1,000 years, museum curators may dissect stains like this for clues about the spiritual life of court officials. All they'll really be analysing is gravity plus neglect. The tea has lost its temperature, leaving behind the sorrowful murk of plant matter steeped into futility. The taste on your tongue is both before and after. Vegetal fatigue, national in scope. Outside, a crow caws once, hoarse, confused. It doesn't care about ceremony, only survival, which feels indecently honest. You envy that crow the same way later clerics will envy simplicity, and then outlaw it. A gust sneaks through the door crack, making the candle wane. Briefly you imagine the flame as history's mood indicator. Low, flickering, short of fuel. Kyoto imperial in name, bankrupt in stamina. The capital holds its breath, you think again. And you almost hear it, the sound of centuries forming. Quiet, but inevitable. And the scene stays suspended, half light, half silence, as if sleep may arrive but not yet, as if even the snow hesitates before covering the last traces of motion. You breathe in one remaining curl of fragrance, dry, delicate, slightly bitter, the taste of time pretending to be divine, and exhale into the growing dark. Asterisk, reality, atom. They always told you that Heian-kyō was a paradise of poetry, fans fluttering under the moon, women whispering waka, while the scent of plum blossoms lingered like enlightenment. The reality? Drafty corridors, freezing baths, chronic constipation, and the constant question of whether you've just inhaled the incense or the carbon monoxide. Welcome to civilization's most refined suffocation chamber, where beauty is cultivated in direct proportion to discomfort. You are seated in the inner room of your wooden mansion, the sort of building that thinks termites are co-tenants rather than invaders. The tatami beneath your knees sighs with every shift of weight. You can almost hear the mildew applauding. The sliding door stands half open, admitting a trickle of air already cold enough to turn breath into visible regret. Beyond it, the courtyard waits, arranged by generations of gardeners to resemble serenity, which is to say, a battlefield of moss and rocks, curated to look accidental. Snow is falling, first of the year, and it lands on the stone lantern, as if trying to remember what light was for. Inside, the tea kettle murmurs like an indecisive ghost. The sound joins the soft crackle of incense charcoal, and together they make a duet titled, "Everything in this world is temporarily smouldering. Your host, the senior retainer, a man so polite that he may have forgotten his own name, moves with ritual precision. Each gesture has been rehearsed for decades, though no one can explain why. Maybe to keep the void from noticing, you perform your part as well. Bow, breathe, lift the cup, sip. The taste is vegetal, slightly metallic, as though the tea remembers the sword used to defend its plantation. The bitterness reaches your tongue, but you pretend to find enlightenment instead. How could you not? The entire Heian elite lives by pretending diplomacy is poetry, pretending poverty is elegance, pretending the emperor still rules something more than the protocol of sitting nicely, while ignored by provincial warlords. The incense tonight is aloes wood, so rare they measure it in syllables rather than weight. The fragment burns reluctantly, an artifact older than your house, perfuming the air with successor's last gasp. Your host notes the fragrance's name with a whisper, Ranjatai, as though invoking a deity or maybe an investment. You nod, because one must always nod when offered history in smoke form. Outside, the snow keeps thickening. Kyoto lies smothered under silence, the kind cultivated by officials who prefer not to notice decline. 2 centuries have passed since the city was erected as the mirror of Tangaera Chang'an, but now it resembles more of a haunted replica shop, still taking customers, but mostly selling nostalgia. Your breath fogs in front of you. You remember the myths, that court life was all romance and moonlight correspondence. You've copied the poems, sometimes even felt a flicker of emotion while tracing the characters on stiff paper. Then you remember your servants' cracked hands, the chill that seeps through the paper walls, and the mice that recite waka on the rafters and claw-scratch Morse. The glory of the Heian, a kind of managed misery wrapped in silk. Would you trade it for the sweaty chaos of some barbarian camp? Probably not. Everyone loves their own prison when it's furnished tastefully. The charcoal pops, sending a spark into the ash bed. A faint scent of resin cuts through the perfume, the smell of realism intruding on all this aesthetic hallucination. You glance again through the opening in the shoji. Snow accumulates on the garden stones like memory, unprocessed. Gentle but relentless. Somewhere in that white layering, you sense centuries beginning. What a pity the palace scribes won't mark 950 CE as anything but another year of poems, appointments, and neglect. Historians love their golden ages neat, but what's golden about endurance? A servant enters to replenish the brazier. The door slides open, and the draft that follows is not poetic in the least. It bites straight through silk. You suppress a shiver and arrange your sleeve with choreographed indifference. The servant's knees are red from kneeling on cold tatami. The smell of smoke clings to her hair. She bows so low you think she might vanish through the floorboards. For a moment you envy her simplicity. She suffers honestly, without ornament. The tea ceremony continues its deliberate crawl toward transcendence. You sense the futility and beauty intertwining, much like ivy around a collapsing gate. You wonder if that's what art truly is, the illusion of control over decay. The brazier's flame trembles. Someone coughs softly, perhaps at the incense, perhaps at the irony. Your host, ever attentive, murmurs about the snow. How pure tonight appears. You respond suitably. Indeed, the heavens have chosen elegance. Both of you know purity in this room is a delusion. The firewood was damp. The paper screens are patched with yesterday's wallpaper. Underneath the tatami live 1,000 small creatures, thriving on crumbs of civilization. But the dialogue must proceed as if you were saints of restraint. You recall a story about Emperor Murakami composing verses on a night like this, comparing falling snow to the dust of deceased courtiers. No one dared mention that the palace roof leaked directly onto the poetry scrolls. You almost laugh, but laughter here is a breach of etiquette. So you exhale quietly, your rebellion reduced to temperature change. Kyoto breathes with you, the same slow rhythm of a city, uncertain whether it's alive or embalmed. Beyond these walls, the aristocracy clings to letter writing and incense identification games, while provincial clans test their swords on each other. You taste metal again in the tea. You think of blood. You smile thinly. Perhaps everything tastes metallic if one anticipates collapse. Your host refills your cup. The steam rises, curling like a minor divinity with self-esteem issues. You stare into it, half expecting revelation, half expecting the face of the future, samurai helmets multiplying like rust. The capital has already begun its quiet surrender to practicality. It does so in your cup, 1 minute swirl at a time. The night deepens. Snowflakes become thicker, heavier, as though they too have grown tired of being metaphor. You sense their weight on the roof beams, pressing down softly but insistently. The rhythm of the falling snow merges with your heartbeat. The world outside this room is being rewritten in silence. History never announces itself. It accumulates, cold and patient. Someone adjusts the incense. The smoke line tilts, frail yet sure. You follow its waver as if it were a graph of the empire's pulse. Still alive, yes, but mostly from habit. You imagine scholars centuries later romanticizing this fragility as grace. Of course they will. Nobody likes to study decline unless it's lit by moonlight and narrated by flutes. You'd want to shake them, these future admirers, and say, "We froze for your aesthetic." But history doesn't return calls. Another pop from the charcoal startles you slightly. Sparks wheel up, die mid-air, leaving a faint afterimage, tiny tragedies rehearsing extinction. You marvel at how even combustion follows etiquette here. Then again you think, so does failure. The host lifts a small lacquer box and offers you another incense chip. Smaller than a fingernail, yet worth someone's yearly tax. As it begins to burn, the fragrance sharpens. There's supposed to be noble sweetness in its scent. Instead, you detect something else, animal, old, like the memory of being alive. It unsettles you in an oddly comforting way. Perhaps holiness is just decay with good public relations. You glance again at the courtyard. The candle within the stone lantern flickers, an idiot flame surrounded by infinite white. The snow has buried half of the stepping stones. Soon the garden will appear pure, unsullied, ready for some poet's performance. You resist the urge to step out and smear a footprint across all that perfection, to prove life hadn't frozen yet. But rituals are stronger than impulses. You remain seated, disciplined by centuries, and tonight's tea. Your companion begins a quiet recitation, a waka about snow concealing the world's impurities. You listen as the syllables fall, uniform and gentle. Poetry as anesthesia. The room smells now of layered smoke, aloes wood first, then sandal, then the faint ghost of firewood resin. The mixture is both intoxicating and exhausting like a drunk saint. Your thoughts wander. You imagine scribes recording your evening. A nobleman practiced incense appreciation as snow blanketed the capital, representing the purity of the imperial court. They won't mention the numb fingers, the mildew breath, the previously used incense chips sold as new. They will write romantic lies, because that's what survives. You smirk at the irony. Civilization may perish, but brand management is eternal. The tea master shifts slightly, perhaps detecting your amusement. He misreads it as enlightenment and nods approvingly. You bow your head to maintain the illusion, wondering how many lives were expended to sustain this choreography of serenity. The answer, you suspect, is enough to fill Kyoto's alleys with ghosts. Wind moves against the shoji, producing a sound like distant applause. Or perhaps warning. The candlelight trembles. Your shadow stretches impossibly long along the tatami, thin as unspent years. Time itself seems to hover, uncertain whether to move forward or curl up for winter. You inhale again, slow, and the incense enters your lungs like a polite secret. And then you remember. This house, like so many others, was built on cut forest. The logs trekked from distant provinces, each trunk dragged by peasants whose names never entered poems. Their sweat hardened into lacquer, their lives condensed into your comfort. The Heian ideal of quietude runs on invisible toil. You sip again, the bitterness deepened by realization. Is enlightenment simply the moment you taste the effort beneath the beauty? Outside, a gust sends snow swirling through the gap of the door. Flakes land on the tatami near your knee, melt instantly. A brief scandal in the order of the room. You think of the empire in the same terms. one white perfection eroded by contact with heat. The snow evaporates, leaving only dampness, which will darken the mat temporarily. A prophecy written in moisture. Your host excuses himself briefly, to fetch more charcoal perhaps. Alone, you allow your spine to slouch an inch. The first honest movement all evening. The silence presses closer, almost tangible. You listen and identify layers. The soft hiss of the brazier, the faint scratching of mice in the beams, the occasional puff of snow sliding off the roof. The city, once designed as a cosmogram, a perfect grid encoding the universe, has grown into entropy. Streets unpaved, estates abandoned. Poetry continued regardless. There's something defiant in that stupidity, you think. Humans don't stop writing verses just because the roof leaks. When he returns, you compose your posture anew. He pretends not to notice. Politeness requires shared blindness. He empties the ashes, replaces them carefully, and you marvel again at how ritual can turn cleaning into cosmic event. Maybe this is why the high-end world lasts as long as it does, because it confuses maintenance with meaning. The talk drifts toward court news, the emperor's latest poem contest, the price of silk from China, rumours of bandits along the Kamo River, each story delivered in whispers, as though treason might overhear. You nod at intervals, an efficient participant. All these trivial fragments, the empire's heartbeat, are rhythmic but persistent. You realise it's late. The candle has shortened to a stub, guiding its own demise. The smell of wax blends with incense, forming something both sweet and tragic. Somewhere far off, maybe by the city gates, a dog howls, a sound too raw for this curated night. You take it as a reminder. Civilization's thinness is measured in walls, not virtue. The host suggests one final cup before rest. You agree. The tea this time is cooler, weaker, a ghost of earlier efforts. You taste fatigue softened by tradition. He remarks on the silence, calls it the form of peace. You don't contradict him, though the word that comes to your mind is suspense. Peace is just war waiting without makeup. You decide to focus on the details. The light glancing off porcelain, the faint tremor in your host's hand, perhaps age or suppressed cough. The snow's reflection seeps through the gap of the door, painting everything with borrowed light. You think, someday archaeologists will find these rooms and call the period opulent. That's what history does. Confuse endurance with luxury, and silence with harmony. Another sip. Your host extinguishes the candle for a moment to listen to darkness. You comply, though you mostly hear your stomach growl. The Heian diet, refined as it is, offers spiritual satisfaction, but no protein. You wonder if monks contemplate the same hunger while pretending to meditate. Maybe enlightenment is just low blood sugar romanticized. When the candle relights, the flame reveals another world, the same, yet changed by absence. You sense the slow drift of time like powder settling in water. The incense has almost burned out. Its smoke forms a thin column before collapsing into nothing. Ashes remain, delicate and self-important. You consider how much of life is exactly this. Fragrance while burning, silence after. The retainer begins storing utensils with ceremonial slowness. Each object in its place. The scoop, the caddy, the whisk. Treated with more affection than most relations between human beings. You almost envy the certainty. Everything here knows where it belongs. Except you. Outside, the wind subsides. The snowfall steadies into a fine mist, aligning with the rhythm of breath. You think of tomorrow. Servants sweeping paths, scribes inventing elegant scores, bureaucrats drafting edicts nobody will read. The empire's machine of appearances will resume as always, powered by habit and resignation. And you'll perform your part again. Because to rebel would require living, and that's precisely what this culture has engineered, out of practice. The host offers a last comment, nearly a whisper. One's spirit must emulate snow, settling only where supported. You respond automatically with a bow, though the phrase lingers. You wonder if that's wisdom or surrender dressed for ceremony. Maybe both. Minutes pass. The air cools as the brazier dims. You wrap your robe tighter, the fabric brushing against skin like memory of warmth rather than warmth itself. The faint scent left in the room is now thinner, almost metallic, a ghost's exhalation after centuries of etiquette. You think back to the start of the evening, to the myth that insisted this age was delicate perfection. In a sense, it wasn't wrong. Perfection is simply decay curated. The capital around you is decaying exquisitely, ensuring future historians a good aesthetic. That might be civilization's cruelest joke, turning collapse into collectible beauty. You finish the remaining tea, now cold. The bitterness doesn't bother you. It feels honest, which is rare. You stare into the dark liquid, seeing not reflection but suggestion. The image of a city that will, in time, yield to new rulers, new aesthetics, new myths. Someone far in the future will reconstruct this night with academic precision and still miss the point, that people here were already ghosts rehearsing their own afterlife. The host closes the sliding door. The room shrinks to its own breathing. For a while, neither of you speaks. The quiet between humans is sometimes the most articulate thing. Snow continues falling outside, patient as bureaucracy, erasing outlines one by one. And you, still seated before the dying brazier, watch the smoke thread dissipate. It rises, bends, and disappears, carrying with it all pretense of divinity. Only the bitter tale of scent remains, a reminder that holiness burns best when dry. You think about myths again, how every period that believes itself eternal is already a museum exhibit in slow motion. Perhaps that's the moral hidden in all these rituals. Not beauty, not order, but rehearsal for disappearance. The fragrance thins, mixing with cold air and the taste of ash. You shift slightly, feeling the floor's chill seep upward. Each exhale joins the room's unspoken chorus of fatigue. You realize you've been chasing calm, the way the Emperor's court chases legitimacy, expensively. The final ember in the brazier glows, its redness faint as memory. Soon it will vanish into grey. You stare, unwilling to move. This, you suspect, is how dynasties end, not with noise, but with etiquette intact. Outside, beyond the door, a crow calls once from some invisible perch, a black note cutting through white silence. You imagine it laughing. The sound fades, swallowed by snow. The incense has surrendered entirely, leaving behind a thin curl of warmth that disperses like a closing chapter. The host remarks softly, "A fine evening." You echo the sentiment, both of you knowing the phrase means nothing except "we are still here." The knight agrees by saying nothing at all. You remain after he leaves, tracing circles in the ash with the tea scoop, a small rebellion disguised as absent-mindedness. Each circle collapses into the next, forming something that faintly resembles infinity or resignation. Difficult to tell the difference. Finally, you exhale, inhaling the lingering scent one more time. It enters cold, exits colder. Beyond the screens, the world is white, slow, timeless, waiting. The capital holds its breath. You think again, and you almost hear it, the sound of centuries forming, quiet but inevitable. And the scene stays suspended, half light, half silence, as if sleep may arrive but not yet, as if even the snow hesitates before covering the last traces of motion. You breathe in one remaining curl of fragrance, dry, delicate, slightly bitter, the taste of time pretending to be divine, and exhale into the growing dark. Myth versus reality. Everyone likes to picture Heian period Kyoto as a floating world of moonlit sleeves and poetry gently bleeding onto fans. That's what the tourist pamphlets, 900 years late, keep whispering. The reality? Termites, stomach cramps, and frostbite delivered with imperial etiquette. Society wrote its own death poem every night and sold the calligraphy as culture. You are right in the middle of it now. The year is 950, and the capital smells of pine smoke and bureaucracy. You sit within a wooden house too quiet for its own age. Tatami under your knees, sigh as if they remember a better dynasty. Beyond the half-open sliding door, snow begins its slow coup d'etat against an already suffering garden. The stone lantern outside wears its cap of white complacently, unaware that moss beneath is turning into ice. Inside, your guide to enlightenment tonight is a line of glowing charcoal and a lacquered tray that promises more than the century can deliver. People will later romanticize these small Japanese rituals. At the moment, they're just slower, more polite versions of insomnia. In front of you, incense smoke threads the air like an indecisive ghost. Every noble family claims its own recipe. Aged aloes wood from a ship that probably robbed 3 ports to get here. Clumps of ambergris vomited by whales that no one has seen but keeps claiming to own. A ridiculous geography in a single whiff. Oceans of trade, sweat of sailors, imperial taxes choking the air. You close your eyes to appreciate fragrance, as the etiquette book demands. What you really notice is that the smoke scratches your throat with the elegance of sandpaper. Refinement hurts. A servant moves soundlessly, pouring water into the tiny brazier kettle. The trickle is supposed to sound like a mountain stream. It actually sounds like what it is: winter water encountering metal. 2 elements that never signed a peace treaty. Heat wavers. The shadow of the kettle merges into the paper wall, distorted by the candle's unsteady light. Kyoto loves instability. It writes poems about it, worships the fleeting, makes decay into property value. You think of the city outside this retreat. The capital, designed in rigid Chinese grid fashion, has already begun to crumble at the corners. Official history calls this elegance. In practice, the gutters reek. The palaces rot while poets invent words for gentle ruin. Everyone senses something shifting. Centralized authority fraying, money piling in the wrong hands, provincial clans learning that swords speak better than decrees. But for now, the only audible rebellion is the kettle hissing. At your side sits the host, a man whose robes are worth several rice fields. He smiles the way someone smiles when desperately hoping divinity still requires witnesses. The snow is early, he whispers, as if weather were an aesthetic choice. You nod, because descent is for servants. The tea ritual begins its choreography. Powdered leaves, bamboo whisk, porcelain so thin you can practically see regret shining through it. You hold the bowl with both hands because one-handed reverence is insufficient in an empire obsessed with posture. Each sip tastes of crushed leaf, memory, and something faintly metallic, perhaps the taste of the sword dangling in history just beyond this tranquil room. The texture sticks to your tongue. The manuals speak of aftertaste as lingering incense, yet all you catch is the bitterness of fields flooded this year, farmers taxed into starvation so that you might watch snow aestheticize itself. You tell yourself you're cultivating sensitivity. You're probably cultivating anemia. The host recites a poem, well, half of one, pausing for you to supply the correct final line. A pleasant little parlor game for aristocrats who fear silence more than famine. You mumble an answer about moonlight and sincerity. He nods, meaning has been successfully exchanged. The ritual satisfied. Outside, a crow shrieks. It does not care about cadence. You trace the rim of your cup. It's cracked, intentionally, the floor filled with gold. Wabi-sabi, someone will call it centuries later, but at the moment it's just an excuse for negligence, varnished with philosophy. You admire it anyway. Beauty, after all, is propaganda interrupted by mortality. And the incense has reached that stage where it no longer rises but sinks. A slow collapse toward the tatami, as if exhausted by its own holiness. The sliding screens quiver slightly. Another gust pushes its cold breath through the seams. The candle gives up its steady flame and begins its unglamorous dance. Shadows ripple over the calligraphy scroll hanging in the alcove. Some saint's poem about impermanence. The irony would choke you if the smoke hadn't done it first. Your mind drifts to the notion of the peaceful and harmonious capital. The literal translation of Heian-kyō. Peaceful if you ignore the trickle of bodies tossed into the Kamo River each month. Harmonious if you're tone-deaf to the groan of too many debts. The palace records mention epidemics as politely as possible. They list death counts between ceremonial appointments. Somewhere tonight, while incense smoulders here, a family out by the Gate District burns straw in hope of a warmth they can't afford. The divergence between myth and fact is already centuries wide. You shift. The floor creaks with the intimacy of bones reminding flesh they came first. Your host notices. The etiquette requires he ignore it. He smiles again, the kind of smile that reheats itself from duty. "Shall we enjoy the next scent?" he asks, as though enjoyment could be legislated. Another thin strip of fragrant wood is placed onto the burning ash. Its smoke unfolds reluctantly, like history forced into another metaphor. You inhale. The note is sharper, piercing the nose, tinged with something animal. Civet, maybe, or the ghost of it. You think of the animals that provided these ingredients, their masked faces, frantic movements, lives turned into invisible luxury. The Empire's perfume hides an ecosystem's scream. You appreciate academically the sensory irony. Another poem in the making, If You Had a Brush and No Conscience. The servants move with calculated humbleness, like satellites around the planet of your host's ego. Their faces remain downward, expressionless, saving emotion for survival. You, privileged guest, perform the same emptiness under a different name. Refinement. That's civilization for you. Evolutionary camouflage disguised as virtue. Wind presses harder against the panels. Somewhere in the corridor, a lone bell chimes. Perhaps metal hitting against a draft. It sounds halfway between prayer and warning. You sip again, throat stinging from both heat and awareness. The host, now slightly drunk on aesthetics, begins to speak about the beauty of snow covering all distinctions. You resist the urge to laugh. Of course, snow erases distinction. That's what death does too. But nobody writes odes to field corpses. Your gaze drifts to the folding screen painted with blue irises. Their pigment, derived from crushed minerals brought by trade caravans, hasn't faded. For a moment you imagine 1,000 workers grinding rock into dust, so nobles could pretend to appreciate impermanence in colour-fast paint. There's your empire, relentless in its contradictions. Maybe civilizations don't fall until their ironies outweigh their armies. The fire dims. Temperature creeps closer to honesty. Breath forms thin ghosts before fading. You talk about the latest court gossip. Someone's love affair. Someone else's scandalous poetry. Because emptiness must be filled to prevent thinking. Thinking leads to questions. And questions awaken the creatures you spend entire rituals trying to lull back to sleep. In the garden, snow thickens. Branches bow, surrendering without resistance. The stone lantern's flame has gone out, leaving only that small mound of lightless white shaped, like a metaphor too easy for poets to resist. You wonder who will preserve this moment in paint or verse. Will they omit the smell of half-extinguished charcoal, the twitch of your tired fingers trying not to shiver? Of course they will. History edits for mood. A soft knock at the corridor. Another servant, this one younger, eyes shaped by fear rather than courtesy, brings a message wrapped in cloth. The host glances at it, nods, hides it inside his sleeve. His tone doesn't change. You suspect politics, someone's favour withdrawn, someone's fortune ending quietly. Yet none of it leaks into his voice. Centuries later, historians will marvel at the composure of the Heian elite. They'll call it serenity, you call it paralysis, with silk trimmings. The candles gutter lower. Wax pools like small comets dying upon contact with reality. The night slides further into stillness, that loaded stillness that seems gentle until you realize it's the sound of pressure just before fracture. You remind yourself that for every refined sigh of poetry, there are 10 peasants muttering prayers outside the city walls. Prayers for rice, not wisdom. The emperor himself, that fragile deity at the heart of bureaucracy, sleeps behind screens embroidered with dragons. His dreams? Probably tax exemptions. The host speaks again. In this purity, one senses the realm aligning, he says. You nearly choke on your tea. Alignment, yes, like vertebrae before execution. You mumble agreement. A professional nod of survival. Everyone here performs spirituality the way future bankers perform moral responsibility, with impeccable gestures. The incense dies down to a faint ribbon of grey. The charcoal collapses into quiet maps of past heat. Everything smells faintly of time turned to dust. For a while, nobody moves. This is called mindfulness. Elsewhere it would simply be called awkward. But you are supposed to feel transcendence. You attempt it, out of politeness. Your knees go numb until they too achieve enlightenment through pain. You listen to the hush outside, the rainless silence of falling snow, and confuse it for peace. It's something subtler though, the city holding its collective breath between eras. Wrong century, wrong temperature, sane human confusion. The host finally signals the end of the ceremony. Hands come together, soft and well rehearsed. Servants start clearing the implements, careful enough to make it seem like they are erasing evidence of something forbidden. You bow, he bows, history bows with you, pretending deference while plotting mutiny. You move toward the door. Cold air slides in like a thief of warmth. The night beyond the veranda glows faintly, a dimension made of paper and frost. The snow has doubled, the garden transformed into a blank manuscript, waiting for anyone bold enough or foolish enough to inscribe meaning. You watch, halfway between dream and chill. Somewhere a fox calls, distant, sharp, either sacred or starving. You think again. Screens, the world is white, slow, timeless, waiting. The capital holds its breath. You think again. And you almost hear it, the sound of centuries forming, quiet but inevitable. And the scene stays suspended, half light, half silence, as if sleep may arrive but not yet, as if even the snow hesitates before covering the last traces of motion. You breathe in one remaining curl of fragrance, dry, delicate, slightly bitter, the taste of time pretending to be divine, and exhale into the growing dark. But the dark doesn't end there. It stretches, unspooled, waiting for someone to mistake it for tranquility. You stay still, watching your exhale vanish. Breath, the only honest ritual left. Your host murmurs something about Dawn's promise. You know better. Dawn doesn't promise, it audits. And Kyoto is about to learn the cost of its serenity ledger. The tapping of snowflakes against bamboo sounds like a broken abacus, the empire's accounting system failing one bead at a time. You think of tax collectors trudging tomorrow through powdered roads, their ledgers icing shut. Behind each mark, a family, a field, a child counted as debt. Beauty, someone once said, is suffering edited for decoration. Welcome to editorial heaven. You slide the door open wider. Cold claws in, latches onto your skin. The scent of burnt incense ghosts around you, stubborn as regret. Inside, servants extinguish the last flame, each movement shrinking the universe towards silence. The host follows, steps measured, a god of small gestures. He thanks you for sharing serenity. You thank him for pretending it exists. Etiquette complete, emptiness restored. Outside, beneath the veranda, the snow muffles the earth into submission. You step onto the plank walkway, the creak under your weight sounding louder than propriety allows. The moon hides behind cloud, embarrassed of its reflection. Somewhere beyond the hill, temple bells prepare to announce another hour nobody once counted. The sound arrives thin, distorted, dragging through the air like the empire's own sigh. You lean against a pillar. For a moment, sensory awareness returns. Fingers numb, breath raw, the scent of pine and smoke biting the back of your throat. You wonder how many lives fit into this fraction of stillness before history resumes its tasks. Because it will resume. It always does, indifferent to your achieved mindfulness. Empires don't dissolve in poetry. They dissolve in paperwork undone, armies unpaid, snow left untended until rot sets in. Your thoughts scroll the future, the Heian period, the later wars, the shoguns rehearsing power through centuries, the foreign ships barking at sheltered harbours. All this seed contained here tonight inside a quiet house, pretending not to know. The snow records it all without opinion. It's neutral, the way truth always claims to be before human interpretation ruins it. Behind you, the host coughs softly, perhaps out of age, perhaps out of the same awareness. This fragile civilization isn't built on stone. It's built on polite coughs and seasonal aesthetics. You wonder if he realizes he is fading along with his profession. Aristocrats must sense extinction the same way incense senses its own smoke thinning. A faint light appears at the horizon, not dawn, but someone's lantern on the outer street. The glow trembles, crossing slush. Early vendors, messengers from the palace, perhaps just another drunk poet seeking cosmic sorrow in natural phenomena. Kyoto endorses all three. You remain still. Observation is the only rebellion left that doesn't ruin your robe. The tea bitterness still lingers in your mouth. It has become symbolic, you suppose. Everything becomes symbolic once hunger is outsourced. You think of the tea itself, imported, ground, whisked, worshipped, a plant that crossed oceans and ended up enforcing etiquette. Globalization before the term existed, disguised as ritual purity. Another irony steeping too long. The host joins you at the veranda. He says each snowflake is unique. You want to tell him that's what people say before finding out they all melt the same. Instead, you nod. Sarcasm isn't part of the official curriculum. He looks at the garden with theatrical melancholy. I hope the dawn finds us unchanged, he whispers. You hope it finds you at all. Embers from the brazier give faint red through the interior darkness, glimmering like nerves under transparent skin. The smell clings. Last stage of incense, that melancholy sweetness no poet dares decipher honestly. It reminds you that everything sacred eventually smells faintly of smoke and denial. Another gust throws fine powder across the veranda boards, stippling your sleeve. The flecks vanish almost immediately, damp absorbed by cloth. You imagine each one a second in disguise. So many seconds. Infinite. All performing vanishing acts simultaneously. That's your empire again. Time performing refinement as it disappears. From somewhere deeper in the garden comes a thump. Snow sliding off a branch. Soundless impact swallowed by cold. Even noise is mannered here. You realize the tranquility isn't natural. It's curated. Every silence costs someone else's scream. You could say the same for art, religion, or statehood. Different incense, same transaction. Your host murmurs another poem fragment. You recognize it. Something about blossoms under snow, purity through concealment. He waits again for your echo line. Words come, brittle. Autopilot courtesy. The air edits them immediately into vapor. The best thing about verse tonight is its mortality. You glance toward the city beyond this enclave. Somewhere the Kamo River snakes dark under thin ice. Fires flicker. Maybe hearths. Maybe arson. The capital shrinks into its breathing core, dreaming of rank and reincarnation. You almost envy its sleep, ignorance wearing silk. Behind your eyelids flicker insinuations of future observers. Tourists, scholars, YouTubers with crisp accents filming documentary episodes. The elegant world of Heian, Japan. Background music, slow pans over lacquer boxes. Not one of them will mention the frostbite. Not one will note the nausea of burning incense mixed with whale vomit. You can almost narrate it yourself. Dark humor for lost empires. Congratulations, you're living through someone's future content. Still, watching the snow, you feel a small, illicit clarity. Civilization is just the art of staging comfort against entropy. The host thinks he's defending culture. He's merely delaying drafts. You're the viewer trapped in 950, pretending detachment equals insight. Perhaps that's the Empire's last enchantment. Convincing people observation counts as virtue. Your hands keep warming themselves by memory. The fire's long gone. Around you, everything folds into monochrome patience. Somewhere inside the house, a servant coughs. Discreet, but undeniable. Mortality never mastered discretion. You listen until the sound fades. If there were gods watching, they must be shivering too. After all, what's divinity without central heating? You laugh under your breath, quietly, the way sacrilege laughs when it knows no one will quote it correctly. The host doesn't hear, he's reciting another appreciation for snowlight. Let him. Everyone copes through poetry. Nobody survives through it. In that half-light, you start counting the layers separating you from the world. Screen, veranda, courtyard, city, time. Each one filters noise, leaving you with distilled quiet. A serenity that feels more like amnesia. Maybe history begins not with battles, but with the moment people forget they're cold. Another candle somewhere attempts resurrection. Flame trembles, then steadies. Its light wobbles across your hands, revealing specks of ash. You rub them away, though you're not sure if they come from incense or centuries collapsing. Both smell the same after a while. You wonder what the chronicles will record about nights like this. The nobles burned incense and contemplated immortality, perhaps. They won't mention the trembling hands, the chill, the creeping suspicion that smell itself might be a substitute for meaning. Official texts detest sensory honesty. The host finally excuses himself. He must prepare a note for the palace courier. You bow, grateful for the temporary solitude. Once he disappears through inner sliding doors, the atmosphere loosens. Servants exhale, the sound nearly human. One of them, bolder or simply tired, glances at you. The glance says everything. We are background instrumentations to someone else's serenity. You return the look, silent agreement across hierarchy's ice. Hours proceed unnoticed. Snow continues its occupation. The garden rearranges itself into pure geometry, lines smoothed, edges erased. Impermanence, that favourite Heian deity, now performs live outside. You watch until your eyes ache from monochrome. Time is perhaps colour deprivation. Eventually, fatigue wins over reverence. You kneel back into the room, sliding the screen shut behind you. Darkness embraces like obligation. The last scent floating in the air is faintly bitter. Perhaps the charcoal is extinguishing itself. For tradition's sake, you whisper the customary phrase, gratitude for shared fragrance, though the only thing you feel grateful for is oxygen. Shadows thicken. Somewhere a melted droplet hits the rim of the brazier with a quiet hiss, as if punctuation to the day's script. You find it soothing. At least punctuation implies an end. You imagine historians centuries ahead debating this very house, this nocturnal ceremony, drawing conclusions about elegance. They'll never capture the aftertaste of metal, the dryness crawling up your nostrils, the absurd solemnity of two humans pretending to influence eternity by sniffing smoke. Their myth will be cleaner. You've inhaled the grime. Snow outside continues its patient conquest. If you opened the screen now, you could probably see reflection enough to write by. Instead, you stay within, wrapped in the dim perfume of exhaustion. The cup before you stands empty, lip-stained by shadow. You watch it as if it might yield philosophy. It doesn't. Objects rarely do. Only scarcity gives them mystique. Somewhere in your chest, a pulse reminds you you're still among the living species. Barely. Your skin feels like paper stretched thin over age. You inhale again, the air colder than forgiveness. Each breath slices a little. The incense has turned totally to ash, but its scent remains like bureaucracy, dead yet omnipresent. Maybe this is what transcendence looks like, endurance mistaken for grace. You stay still, listening to the structural groans of the house. Wood expands, contracts, a living thing negotiating with temperature. Centuries from now, restorers will marvel at such craftsmanship, without realizing they are hearing echoed complaint of ancient timber forced to outlive its tenants. The thought almost amuses you. Everything here is protracted suffering stylized into legacy, tea into ceremony, smoke into spirit, decay into decor. You glance once more at the hanging scroll. The calligraphy declares, all things perish. True, but not before someone invoices beauty for the service rendered. You breathe out slowly, as though releasing centuries ahead of schedule. The air shivers over the brazier remains, curls upward, disappears, and the scene stays suspended. Half light, half silence, as if sleep may arrive but not yet, as if even the snow hesitates before covering the last traces of motion. You breathe in one remaining curl of fragrance, dry, delicate, slightly bitter, the taste of time pretending to be divine, and exhale into the growing dark. Myth versus reality. Ancient Japan wasn't all cherry blossoms gently drifting atop ideals of refinement and haiku-ready melancholia. It was mostly drafts sneaking under the sliding doors, the smell of mildew overtaking the incense, and a quiet sort of tension that came from knowing every gesture was graded like a bureaucratic exam. You've seen the museum version, the kimono draped over a mannequin with a placard promising elegance. Reality. That silk weighed like an obligation. Beauty was homework, pleasure, a practical test in restraint. You are sitting where a dynasty imagines perfection should feel warm. It doesn't. The brazier gives a hint of reddish glow, but mostly sighs its last. Charcoal dust trembles in the air, whispering that luxury is just controlled combustion. The tatami beneath you is clean, yet the straw fibers itch against your palms, reminding you of labor. Someone's calloused hands wove this texture to impress a lord who will never touch a sickle. The sliding door between you and the courtyard stands half open. Through it, the first snow of winter falls, slow enough to look poetic, fast enough to ruin any outdoor ceremony. The garden stone lantern already carries a soft cap of white, like a head made foolish by age. You tell yourself you are here for beauty, but your spine doesn't agree. So many hours kneeling like devotion quantified, the famous Heian posture of refinement, slowly converting into back pain. The mistress of the house, serene behind her painted screen, waits for the incense to finish its final breath. Because timing defines grace. If the smoke winds too fast, someone is uncultured. Too slow, someone is morbid. You consider coughing just to test the limits of propriety, but even your cough would require a lineage of elegance. The snow muffles everything outside. No footsteps, no dogs, no cries from the city where merchants cheat monks with counterfeit silk. Here, sound becomes an endangered species. Only the faint crackle of wood shrinking against winter persists. You think of Kyoto around 950, officially capital of sophistication, unofficially a rumour between damp forests. The palace radiates poems. The alleys radiate sewage. When the chronicles write of an age of peace, what they mean is, nobody big enough to cause civil war survived yet. Inside the house, tonight's script runs as scheduled. Incense first, powdered aloes wood, carefully measured like sin, heated on mica plates above the coal. The host pinches a flake with chopstick precision, drops it onto the plate, and waits. The room holds its breath. Then tea's served afterward. Thick, dark, bitter as medicine, the opposite of soothing. You think of those modern reenactments where everything gleams under spotlights, actors pretending to understand tranquility. They always forget the smell. They forget that incense in a thin building with poor ventilation turns heaven into migraine in under 15 minutes. The ritual interprets silence as loyalty. You are loyal to the moment, though secretly you count the seconds until pins and needles crawl up your legs. There's comedy in that discomfort. Centuries later, scholars will call this an aesthetic of restraint, as though spiritual enlightenment were produced by a circulation problem. You know better. Humans invent beauty whenever pain becomes too ordinary. The colder the night, the finer the poetry. A servant moves in, a silhouette against the paper door. He bows so low that his top knot nearly touches the tatami. His joints creak, not from devotion but age. The sound is almost tender. He offers the incense box, lacquer black, gold flecks, imitating starlight lost behind winter clouds. You lift the lid. Inside, fragments, some pale, others like fossilized honey. Each has a name referencing heaven or foreign merchants. Ritual insists you pick by memory, not by scent. You choose the one called Wind-Crossed Plum, translation. Imported from somewhere expensive, guaranteed to smell like nostalgia. Once lit, the smoke crawls upward, reluctant. It coils and loosens as though confused which century it belongs to. You inhale, sharp, resinous, faintly sweet, and suddenly your nose registers everything the poet ignores. Damp plaster, burnt rice from the kitchen, the residue of humanity trying too hard to erase itself. The scent doesn't purify. It categorizes decay. That's the real achievement of high art, making decomposition seem tasteful. Who are you in this scene? Official? Scholar? Ghost waiting for better conversation? The distinction blurs. In Heian-kyō, individuality was paperwork. Your gestures are pre-written. You lean forward with the soft hesitation prescribed for the elite, the way someone approaches a fragile confession disguised as aroma. The host watches your every movement. Her smile is the kind learned from centuries of portraits, slightly closed eyes, lips curved minimally, implying secret amusement without revealing teeth. Because showing teeth means hunger, and hunger has no business in paradise. Outside the half-open door, snow deepens upon the stone lantern. You measure time not by clocks, those don't exist, but by how silent everything grows. Every additional layer of snow subtracts a sound. You wonder how many layers it takes to erase history entirely. Someone shifts behind you. The sliding panel sighs. Another guest enters, a court poet, famous for writing love letters no one believes. He folds himself down beside the brazier, glances at the cooling coals, and mutters some refined commentary about winter purity. It sounds like complaint disguised as wisdom. You resist the urge to laugh. He's wearing layered robes that probably weigh more than his sincerity. The fabric droops where dampness caught, releasing a faint smell of wool and regret. Tea follows incense. The hostess motions. Bow, pour, sip, admire. Words rise and fall like rehearsed music. You hold the bowl close enough to see the reflection of trembling firelight. The tea's surface quivers, a miniature earthquake contained by manners. Its taste is thick, like drinking forest soil filtered through courtesy. This is supposedly enlightenment boiled. People centuries later will romanticize it. They'll babble about wabi-sabi, humble simplicity, spiritual grace. Here and now, it just tastes faintly of moss and burnt roots. You swallow it anyway because rebellion would inconvenience the servants. You glance at the hostess again. Her robes are lighter than the poet's but more intricate. A system of colours signifying season, rank, and mood. Tonight, muted grey lavender for early winter. Elaborate understatement. Her face carries the powder that future generations will misinterpret as beauty instead of chalky armour. Tiny crack lines show near her temple when she tilts her head. You imagine those cracks expanding like maps of civilization, aesthetics spreading until they forget why they exist. The brazier emits a glow barely strong enough to defend the moment. You'd swear the temperature inside is equal to an empty confession. Above, the ceiling beams sweat with condensation. Centuries later they'll rot, but tonight they only glitter faintly, witness to desperate refinement. You think again, why do humans worship silence? Perhaps because noise remembers them too clearly. Silence allows myth. A draft snakes in through the gap of the door, brushes your wrist, and for an instant the illusion collapses. The smell of actual snow violates the perfume. Clean, cold, brutal. The incense falters, its spiral thins. The poet's conversation fades to murmurs. The hostess pretends not to feel the chill. You imagine the snow outside stacking itself like bureaucracy, form upon form, each freezing what remains of spontaneity. What was Kyoto, really? A city pretending continuity while nobles moved through ceremonies that could not admit death. Epidemics, fires, earthquakes, all politely avoided in literature. Yet the wooden houses remembered. They creaked with every ghostless night. This mansion of polished beams and screens is no exception. You can hear faint booming in the wood as the temperature falls. It's the sound of architecture praying to survive till dawn. The tea is finished. Etiquette demands you admire the bowl's glaze, as if it holds cosmic truths. You know it holds fingerprints. Ancient glaze formulae mixing ash, clay, and accident. And still scholars will later call them intentional imperfections. Maybe everything considered profound is just an error that survived. Someone asks the poet for a verse. He hesitates, looks at the lantern's snowy cap visible through the door, and recites something about purity blanketing the world. Everyone nods, as though meaning were achieved. You sense desperation behind the verse, the need to translate cold into moral value. Snow equals virtue because suffering needs reward. You consider responding with humor. Say, purity is just filth, disciplined. But you bite your tongue. The hostess's smile shifts, slower, heavier, sign that laughter outside approved boundaries may trigger cultural extinction. You pour another bowl. Steam curls upward, and for a second it aligns with incense smoke. The two plumes merge, aroma masquerading as spirit. You find it strangely tragic, smoke aspiring to permanence. Every exhalation claims eternity until vanished. You wonder if the gods find this amusing, the mortals burning things to simulate transcendence. Somewhere a distant bell rings, maybe temple, maybe servant signaling midnight. The sound slides over the roof like thin metal sorrow, echoes into the snow. You realize the house is surrounded by invisible layers of ceremony, the same way the city is surrounded by its own myth. They promised refinement. They delivered suppression. History will remember the Heian period for poetry, for calligraphy, for measured hearts, rarely for cold toes, failing joints, or the mildew behind decorative screens. That's your duty tonight, to inhale myth, exhale reality, perhaps cough discreetly. The hostess begins closing the door to narrow the view of the courtyard. Snowflakes brush past her sleeve, melting instantly, leaving dark spots on silk. Each spot joins the pattern like punctuation. She murmurs about how beauty rests in transience. You nod, aware that transience in practice means costly repairs next morning. The ritual transitions toward its end. A bow, a soft farewell, a promise that serenity has been achieved. Yet serenity feels suspiciously similar to exhaustion. Every participant remains kneeling, as though afraid to stand, because standing would remind them how the body contradicts philosophy. You test your weight on one knee. Pain responds like ancient scripture. Complex, unavoidable, instructive. You imagine audience centuries later watching this scene. Narrators like me explaining in ironic tones about spiritual distances. You picture the video thumbnail, Heian Japan, the era that invented anxiety decor. They'd laugh. You'd freeze. Yes, civilization makes fine content. The incense stick reduces to its last ember. The hostess passes an iron pin to crush the ash, murmuring another phrase about gratitude. You feel oddly moved, not by ritual but by its fragility. The ash looks like memory powdered and stored for eventual misunderstanding. Outside, snow keeps falling. The lantern disappears halfway beneath it, turning into a faint mound with a flicker trapped inside. You think of the city beyond this property. Rows of similar houses, silent competitions, fever under makeup. In the imperial palace, scribes record poetry for tomorrow's reading, ignoring that half the court currently sneezes from the cold. Still, they'll call it pure language. You stretch your fingers lightly above the brazier, warmth faint but significant. You ask yourself, when did humans first confuse smoke with salvation? The hostess notices your motion. She nods approvingly, interprets it as aesthetic acknowledgement. You smile back, remembering the line between sincerity and politeness is thinner than mica on a perfume plate. The poet beside you speaks once more, voice lower than the crackling coal. He says something about eternity frozen in each flake. You picture eternity melting before reaching ground. The humour surfaces, dark, tired, honest. You tell him that eternity is just the story snow tells before groundwater proves otherwise. He laughs nervously. The hostess sighs. She finds the remark uncouth. Yet truth always stains ceremony eventually, like wine seeping through silk. The brazier's coals collapse. A small puff of ash rises, hovers in midair like phantom breath. The servant rushes forward to adjust. His hands blur in the dim light, practical amid pretense. For a moment, humanity leaks. He's hungry. He's freezing. He wonders if his master will ever let him out early. Then he resumes composure. You shift slightly, watching winter accumulate its joke. Time crawls. The manuscripts will soon describe such nights with verses full of moon and stillness, forgetting the smell of burnt hair when a sleeve brushed too close to fire. You heard that smell once, earlier tonight, barely noticeable but human enough to survive memory. Should beauty hurt this much to maintain? The question slinks through your skull like rumor, because behind every aesthetic lie, unpaid workers, unwashed garments, suppressed laughter, and incense, the ultimate metaphor, things that vanish elegantly are praised even while killing oxygen. The poet stares at your half-empty bowl. He asks if you taste enlightenment. You reply, tastes like overbrewed civilization. He doesn't know whether to laugh or meditate. Quiet expands again, thick as old fabric. The snowstorm outside mutates from gentle to persistent. The room loses dimension. Everything flatters silence. You almost imagine hearing frost crack against window frames, except there are no windows, only paper screens pretending privacy. You wonder who first called this age golden. Gold hates moisture. This room is soaked in it. The size of tea, the sweat of wood, the mist pulled from dying coals. If heaven required humidity, Kyoto would have ascended. The hostess begins gathering utensils. Each movement describes accuracy perfected by repetition until stripped of soul. Her fingers tremble slightly. Not a tremor, rather complication of grace. You could tell she's thinking of the repairs tomorrow, of how the charcoal budget exceeded expectations, of how poetry seldom pays bills. You are tired but oddly awake, sustained by the absurd precision around you. Each breath seems measured by a code older than honesty. You suspect the house itself enforces manners, its beams scold every improvised exhale. The poet yawns without open mouth, the kind of half gesture that costs generations of training. Humans learned to hide fatigue before they learned to share truth. You watch sunlight that never appears, because tonight promises only snow. It's midnight now. In theory, sleep follows. In practice, people remain half alive guarding dignity. The incense dish cools. Ash traces concentric circles like fossils of intent. Someone whispers prayers disguised as appreciation. The hostess responds with another bow, deeper than required. Ceremony devours companionship. You've often wondered whether these aristocrats felt isolated in their elegance. Answer, probably yes. But decorum forbade naming loneliness. They wrote poems about night chrysanthemum because I'm sad, lacked refinement. You can hear ghostly versions of those poems swirling with the smoke. 1,000 metaphors for absence. The snow presses against the veranda edges, slipping between planks. A faint moisture creeps across the tatami, expresses quiet rebellion against dryness. One servant notices, blots it with cloth, and apologizes to the floor aloud, because the floor, technically older than he is, ranks higher in dignity. The brazier emits final crack. The smell changes. Now iron, now ending. You give up counting the seconds. Time feels untranslatable. Somewhere inside your chest, humor takes refuge. Myth says refinement. Reality says carbon monoxide poisoning at elite level. Your eyelids droop. The poet's voice fades entirely. Snow keeps writing over everything outside. You realize the night won't conclude neatly. Beauty demands suspension, not completion. You shift once more, stretch your numb legs beneath robes. Blood returns in slow rebellion. Pain equals proof of existence. Someone might call that enlightenment. You call it circulation. The hostess pours last water over coal. Steam leaps, struggles, dies. Its ghost rises to mingle with leftover incense. They merge in mid-air, like exhausted ideals finally surrendering identity. And then there is nothing spectacular, only breath. You inhale smoke, exhale century. Faint taste of bitterness clings to your tongue. It promises memory, or infection, whichever lasts longer. Outside, wind moves faintly among the eaves, scattering early snow. Somewhere, a crow complains, a sound that doesn't belong to myth. You listen, as if recognizing truth disguised in feathers. The hostess invites you to admire the fragrance's residue. The servant lifts the mica plate. Ashes slide off like dead skin. Beautiful, someone murmurs. You think, everything is beautiful when we agree to ignore smell. Now silence turns heavy enough to bruise thought. You've entered that interval of half light and half silence, when awareness becomes its own mausoleum. You draw a deep breath, feel winter scraping lungs. The incense has ceased, the tea bowl empty, yet both persist conceptually, proof that art wins by haunting. You breathe out slowly, as though releasing centuries ahead of schedule. The air shivers over the brazier remains, curls upward, disappears, and the scene stays suspended, half light, half silence, as if sleep may arrive but not yet, as if even the snow hesitates before covering the last traces of motion. You breathe in one remaining curl of fragrance, dry, delicate, slightly bitter, the taste of time pretending to be divine, and exhale into the growing dark. It is the kind of moment that mythmongers crave. A court noble ready to drift into enlightenment, Kyoto blanketed by purity, the scent of immortality twining around a soul about to transcend. Romantic, right? Too bad reality smells mostly of burnt ash and mildew. The poetic hush is nice until you remember your servant forgot to shut the inkstone lid again, and it's drying into a tiny monument of negligence. You'll still blame yourself, though. Self-reproach has always been Japan's favourite long-term investment. So you sit, half timeless, half cold, while the first snow thickens against the shoji screens. The house breathes too, in that wood-on-wood sigh old buildings make when winter starts pressing its thumbs against their patience. You might call it serene. Or you might notice the flicker of a moth that somehow survived November, a paper-thin inheritance from the summer, losing its mind against the lamp, trapped between survival and suicide. Don't worry, the metaphor is obvious from here. The kettle releases its last whisper, a thin convulsive hiss. Tea session over, philosophy still unpaid. You could tidy the implements, bow to the ghost of etiquette, extinguish the ember. Or you could stare into the brazier and imagine your descendants, hundreds of years from now, paying good money to gawk at slightly charred tatami fragments in a museum vitrine under the label Early Heian Domestic Serenity. What they won't realize is how drafty serenity actually was. Your back aches. That's not symbolism, just the cost of sitting correctly for too long. Every age has its orthopedic religion. Today it's wooden floors and straight spines. Later it'll be lumbar support chairs and ergonomic gilt. Civilization keeps changing the furniture, never the pain. The fragrance still lingers, faint as memory. You'd chosen clove and agar wood tonight, supposed to inspire introspection. Congratulations, it worked too well. The smell has folded in on itself, thickening the silence until sound feels like sacrilege. You start hearing absurd things, the snow ticking against the lantern, the sigh of bamboo gutters, and beneath it all, a slow drag of your heartbeat, tuning itself to the rhythm of centuries. Maybe that's what art does, rewires boredom into eternity. You think back to the opening of the ceremony, how neatly you washed your hands, how the charcoal hissed when laid on cinder, how the apprentice knelt like humility incarnate. The whole thing looked painfully precise from outside, but you knew the shaky truth beneath. The matches had been damp, the incense slit refused to catch. A gnat drowned heroically in the tea bowl before being scooped out with courtly detachment. Every aesthetic masterpiece hides a cleanup scene behind it. Ask any curator. Outside, the snow builds its empire in silence. Funny you consider how empires depend on silence. Armies, taxes, reforms, while snow does it effortlessly overnight. The bamboo roof beams are white now. By morning they'll sag with the collected weight of poetry. Inside your sleeve, your fingertips have gone stiff. An aristocratic frostbite. You lift the tea bowl again, though it's empty, just to feel the warmth memory left on the ceramic. Bodies cool, objects remember. That's the real hierarchy of the Heian world. From the corridor comes a creak, someone shifting, maybe the attendant, maybe history itself repositioning for comfort. You don't turn. If you look, you'll break the illusion that this loneliness is chosen. Better to sit inside the myth, at least for another breath. After all, myth pays better ratings later. Your gaze catches on the ink painting nailed to the post. A single pine tree and a bird too abrupt for identification. probably meant as a crane but assembled by sheer panic near the end of the brushstroke. Yet its crookedness makes it believable. Perfection is boring. The divine started losing followers the moment someone invented shading. When the wind presses against the sliding door, you imagine the world out there, the streets of Kyoto curling under snow, couriers cursing their sandals, watchmen half asleep with frost on their beards, poets composing death-ready verses about love that never happened. Beneath the eaves, dogs are being dogs, terrible Buddhists but effective metaphysicians. Every ordinary sound outside reminds you that this stillness you perform is an expensive illusion maintained by other people moving. You remember the Emperor's new edict last month. Ban on excessive music after midnight. Too many drunken aristocrats composing imperial odes that read like diary meltdowns. The court said it was about propriety. The city answered with laughter muffled under sake breath. Order survives only because disobedience gets tired first. You flex your fingers again, study the faint trace of ash on your nails. Somewhere in you is an absurd pride. You, a small link in the chain of centuries that will call this refinement. But the longer you look, the more the pride resembles fatigue dressed for ceremony. Culture here feels like a beautifully written apology letter to entropy. You roll another stick of incense between your palms, watch the powder dust like old snow. Supposed to symbolize impermanence, but if impermanence needs this much rehearsal, maybe it's faking modesty. You light it anyway, because repetition comforts even cynics. The scent rises, less sweet now, more resigned. Imagine if every generation had its smell charted out, Nara era reeking of damp silk and skepticism. Your own decade of cinnamon and politics, later ages perfumed by industrial optimism. Archaeology through nostrils. You chuckle at the idea. The apprentice slides the door a fraction, peers in to confirm you're still breathing. He bows, awkwardly, afraid to intrude. Young faces in this house all look like they're auditioning for afterlives. You nod dismissal. The door sighs shut. The silence comes back, relieved that humanity has left the building. A droplet of melted snow falls from your sleeve and splashes onto the tatami. The mark spreads in perfect etiquette, all angles clean. It will vanish in a minute, as ephemeral as a dynasty's last decree. You think of the chroniclers who'll someday write about tonight's generation, as if everyone lived in a perpetual moonbeam of elegance. You want to warn them. Half of us smell like damp planks. The other half spend evenings arguing about the price of ink. But history hates being contradicted by witnesses. It prefers corpses. They keep better silence. The brazier ghosts downward, its red heart flickering out. In the absence of light, every movement becomes indecent. You close your eyes and let the dark adjust around you like an expensive robe. Someone centuries later will call this moment spiritual. They'll be wrong. It's just under-oxygenated. Still, the darkness does something the lantern couldn't. It levels things out. The room, the snow, your body, all equally invisible, all equally temporary. You think for a wild moment that maybe this is what peace intended to be before civilizations monetized it. Simple absence, not perfection. The tea warmth in your stomach fades. You remember the taste. Earth folded into liquid light. There had been a pinch of plum vinegar earlier. A tonic for longevity. Joke's on you. Longevity is only good marketing when you can outlive your body odor. You grin at the absurdity and almost spill the invisible tea you're no longer holding. A sound outside. Thin laughter carried from another compound. Perhaps a late visitor. Perhaps the snow cracking under its own beauty. You feel unexpectedly human hearing it. Because no matter how much incense you burn, or how many ceremonies you attend, being human around midnight still means listening for other human noises to prove you're not alone. Your mind drifts to that first line the storyteller will use about you, the myth packaged for the next millennium. A noble in Kyoto, winter night, incense, enlightenment imminent. Never mind the chapped lips, the stiff knee, the smoke making your eyes sting. Nobody wants saints with psoriasis. The room cools further. Condensation arranges itself across the lacquer box like a second layer of translation. You trace a finger through it. sketching a tiny circle. The act feels significant, even though it isn't. But significance has always been a conjuring trick. Empty gesture plus good lighting equals philosophy. In some absurd corner of imagination, you picture the future again. Tourists with cameras instead of calligraphy brushes, flashing these same corridors to capture authenticity through pixels. They'll buy replicas of your tea bowl, mass-produced in a factory that has never heard of snow. Progress isn't improvement. It's repetition with stronger lighting. You breathe out, the smoke meets your breath and disappears into itself. Unity achieved through mutual exhaustion. That's enlightenment enough for any century. You blink, there's motion outside the screen door again. Faint, deliberate sweeping. Must be the housekeeper brushing snow off the veranda. You imagine her broom tracing wide arcs, delicate, patient, as though editing the night to her liking. If civilization depends on anyone, it's her, not the poets. She keeps the myth functional, while you sit here pretending to be its author. In the far distance, beyond the hills, Kyoto's temples begin their muffled bell tones. Slow, heavy, slightly off-pitch because humidity has its own theology. The notes drip one after another down into your hearing. Each toll announces an hour your life won't reuse. Centuries later, tourists will describe those bells as timeless, proving once again that people love to lie politely about decay when it sounds noble. You whisper to the empty room, half saying, half thinking, everything sounds sacred once it's expired. The phrase dissolves like snow melting on the tongue. The truth, audible only to you, is that sacredness is just expiration performed gracefully. You reach for the writing board beside you, sliding it carefully so it doesn't squeal. There's a fragment of a poem you'd started earlier about moonlight drowning itself in tea. Too ornate even for your age. You cross it out and write another line. The snow corrects what we over-describe. For a moment, you enjoy it. Then you realize it's true. The air bites now. You lift the robe collar higher, smell of smoke nesting near your throat. Every inhalation becomes a ledger of scents. The agar wood the attendants will resent cleaning tomorrow, the faint vinegar of aging lacquer, the metallic ghost of the brazier. Your lungs record it all. Historians with too much access. And here we circle back to myth versus reality, don't we? The myth says Heian-kyō was a floating world of elegance, of quiet minds tracing beauty like a signature in silk. The reality, as you can now confirm with your freezing toes, was mostly smoke, bureaucracy, and the daily challenge of not setting fire to your sleeves. You smile into the dark. That smile is centuries older than irony, but functions the same way as anesthesia. Humor, the only legitimate incense left. You imagine addressing some invisible audience beyond the wall of time. See? We weren't enlightened saints. We were just early humans trying to stay warm. If you shut your eyes tighter, you can almost hear them. Future chroniclers, history buffs, armchair philosophers analysing your century as if it were an art installation. They'll talk about the aesthetics of stillness and zeitgeist of transience, using more syllables than you've had meals this week. None of them will mention the cough you've cultivated from indoor smoke. But that's the tax for living inside art. Health is always the first draft. And yet, despite everything, the chill, the irony, the hopelessly repetitive beauty, you feel something like gratitude rising through the exhaustion, because even the lie feels beautiful when executed with such devotion. Perhaps that's what culture truly is, a professionally crafted hallucination sustained by volunteers who know better, but continue anyway. Outside, the snow deepens its argument. The lanterns are now only faint smudges, their light folding inward, unwilling to compete. Somewhere in the city, a rooster misreads the hour. The sound is ridiculous, therefore perfect. You stretch one hand across the tatami, feeling the seam lines like old pages. Beneath those seams are generations of repairs, layers of straw remembered and replaced. The floor literally composed of histories sitting one atop another, like the layers of your own unresolved thoughts. And still, each night you pretend it's seamless. That's civilization again, pretending long enough for the illusion to stabilize into heritage. Your eyelids droop, but you resist. Sleep is too simple a finale for a night this carefully constructed. Instead, you inhale again, tasting the final curl of incense as it thins. Dry, delicate, slightly bitter, the same flavour that began this entire evening. Memory loops upon itself, the ceremony concluding not with revelation, but precision. You think about the word art. Tonight it looks less like creation and more like an agreement between lonelinesses. The artisans who shaped your bowl, the servants arranging embers, the courtiers perfecting meaningless gestures, every one of them carving tiny loopholes against oblivion. Maybe art wins by haunting because haunting is the only way memory stays funded. Your vision trembles with fatigue. The snow outside blurs into a single luminous sheet, a parchment waiting for centuries to write themselves on it. You imagine someone in a distant future, say, a skeptical narrator on a darkly humorous channel, retelling this very night. They'd say, myth versus reality, Kyoto 950 AD. Spoiler, nobody was transcending anything. They were just tired and cold. You'd almost applaud them from here, across time, if your fingers weren't so numb. You draw one last deep breath. The smoke is nearly gone. The air now plain again, unperfumed, earnest. The same kind of air that will fill hospitals, factories, lecture halls, all descendants of this fleeting luxury. But continuity is humbling and hilarious. You imagine history itself coughing politely, waiting for you to finish so it can move on. What remains? Not the tea, not the ceremony, not even the incense ash that will be swept away at dawn. What remains is the lingering idea that moments like this meant something greater. And maybe they do, precisely because you doubted them while living through them. Skepticism is devotion's mirror. Together, they keep culture breathing. The fire gives one last brittle sigh. You respond with another breath, yours slower, more deliberate. A tiny truce between lungs and illusion. In the silence that follows, you can almost hear snowflakes striking each other, soft duels of gentle annihilation. The universe performs its own tea ritual for no audience, burning no incense, asking nothing in return. You smile again, faint as the embers. Once, you thought transcendence was a matter of technique. Now, you suspect it's simply exhaustion performed elegantly. So you sit, unmoving, allowing the cold to sharpen into clarity. If the myth demands a final image, let it have this: a solitary figure in a wooden house, surrounded by fading fragrance, watching the night whiten into forgetfulness. History loves symbols. Let it feed. You know better. You know that art doesn't prevail by triumphing, but by persisting as residue. Pollen in the lungs of time, reminder of scent long after meaning evaporates. The myth will call it grace, the reality is stubbornness. Same difference. The last drift of incense folds upward, faint as a lost thought. You watch it with the calm precision of someone timing their own disappearance. The breath you release feels wider than the room, carrying fragments of burnt wood, regret, and reluctant peace. Outside, dawn threatens, but does not arrive. The snow hesitates mid-air, as though uncertain whether to fall at all. You think that's fitting. Even nature practices indecision before beauty. And so you exhale once more into the growing dark, measuring the years that will cite this night as an example of refinement, while forgetting the chill that outlasted elegance. You wonder how future scholars will romanticize your numb fingers. Maybe they'll call it disciplined grace. Maybe they'll invent a new word for pretending convincingly. Either way, they'll be wrong, and you forgive them in advance, because myth always wins the footnotes, but reality writes the smell. And right now the smell is ordinary smoke, tinged with cold metal, honest as fatigue. It saturates the air until even memory will need to open a window. You let that honesty settle. The world tilts slightly. Perhaps it's you, perhaps the foundation shrinking under frost. The brazier now only a blackened bowl. The snow outside silently conquers the city, one roof tile at a time. You close your eyes, not in reverence but resignation. Somewhere far beyond the shoji, another century exhales. Another myth prepares to be born. You allow this one to end the way all real nights do. Unrecorded, unperfected, utterly alive in its decay. When the last wisp of smoke climbs toward nothing, you follow it with your eyes and understand. No empire, no ceremony, no polished tradition survives except through fragments mistaken for light. That's your final lesson to the unseen audience, if they're still listening. Art doesn't conquer time, it merely clings, patient as incense to a burnt sleeve, long after the wearer has moved on. And so you breathe out the last note of the ritual, centuries ahead of schedule, into air now free of stories yet heavy with their ghosts. Outside, the snow completes what words cannot. Inside, silence becomes the only accurate archive. The myth promised serenity, the reality delivered frostbite. And for once, both tell the same truth. You smile at that symmetry, then let your lungs empty completely. The darkness absorbs the gesture with professional detachment, the way history always does. And in that quiet where fragrance used to be, the world finally exhales with you, long, tired, untraceably human. Endure that single shared breath long enough, and perhaps that, or nothing at all, is what they'll call enlightenment. The air shivers once, disperses, vanishes. You stay still. Darkness wins on points.